From droughts to flooding to rising temperatures and poor air quality, the climate crisis is firmly entrenched in our daily lives. And we're all being encouraged to do our bit. Recycle, be water wise, use cleaner sources of energy. But it seems the world's big banks are not coming to the party. In fact, they're doing the opposite by bankrolling projects involving fossil fuels. The recently released Banking on Climate Chaos report has identified the Royal Bank of Canada as the worst offender. Last year, the bank bankrolled projects involving fossil fuels to the tune of 760 billion rand. Let's unpack this further with Tabitha Paine, who's an attorney in the Corporate Accountability and Transparency Programme at the Centre for Environmental Rights. Tabitha, thanks so much for giving us some clarity on this issue. And that report, the Banking on Climate Chaos report, the big headline of that report on the website says the world's 60 biggest banks poured over $5.5 trillion over 7 years into the fossil fuel industry, driving climate chaos and causing deadly local community impacts. I was quoting there. So that figure, $5.5 trillion, that's almost unfathomable if we were to transfer that into rands. Give us some context on these figures. Have they gone up? Have they gone down?
Sure. And thank you so much for having me on your program. It is, like you say, it's an unfathomable amount of money. A lot of people struggle to imagine billions, never mind trillions of dollars. I guess the main gist of the report is that fossil fuels are still a heavily invested and heavily funded project and baseline. There has been a slight decrease from 2021 to 2022, which is where the report looks at. So it goes from 2016 to 2022. And from 2021, there has been a decrease in the amount of funding of fossil fuels overall. But I think what's important to understand is this is an aggregate that they're looking at, and then they look at sector-specific funding. So if you look at, for example, oil and gas, that sector, particularly the exploration of gas, has increased, and it's increased by a substantial amount, by 50%. So it was in 2021, it was invested $15.2 billion, and in 2022 that jumped to $23 billion. So it's quite substantial. If you look at why there's been a decrease overall, so from 2021 to 2022, but an increase in certain sectors, obviously you have to take into account global events. So one of the major ones would be the war in Ukraine, and the consequence of that has been a huge profit-driven motivation from companies and the banking sector. The problem is that throughout this, we have a science-based target, one that doesn't move, and it's as inconvenient as it is, it needs to be adhered to if the planet is going to continue to be inhabitable. And that's a 1.5 degree increase in the level of temperature globally.
Tabitha, is there any universal energy finance legislation that prescribes how much banks and other major financiers are allowed to push into fossil fuels, or is that pretty much guided by those energy and climate change agreements, which, some countries, pay lip service to, but simply don't meet their goals?
Absolutely. And that's part of the problem, is that the energy sector and the finance sector do not have any legislative mandate or an obligation set in stone. What they have is voluntary policies that they adopt or do not adopt. And what we've seen, particularly in this report, is that regardless of whether they have policy or not, overall, the banks are still investing and supporting fossil fuel expansion and current projects. They have got what is called the Net Zero Alliance. So that's where banks have undertaken to eliminate fossil fuel investment by 2050. And policy does make a difference. So if you look at the top polluters, so the top 3 polluters, as you say, it's the Royal Bank of Canada and it's JP Morgan. They don't have good policy at all. So they don't have sector-specific policies that provide exclusions from investing in those sectors, as those are usually the sectors that are most harmful to the environment and people. So you can see that the top ones don't have policy. So policy obviously does make a difference, but it's not enough. The banks need to walk their talk in addition to having policy.
Tabitha, to what extent is this prevalent in South Africa, in which big banks have been mentioned in this report that we should be aware of locally?
So the report is also quite narrow. It only looks at the top 60 global banks. And I think quite luckily, South Africa's banks don't feature on there. But that doesn't mean that our banks aren't contributing towards fossil fuel development. It just means that they didn't make the top 60. You can tell a bit of the effect that South Africa has within its own ecosystem, if you will, and that's through the global oil and gas exit list, which was also released recently. It was last week, in fact. And what you can see there is we're still getting banks who are investing in fossil fuel projects and companies. The kind of big difference here is that the banking on climate chaos is talking specifically about banks, whereas the investing in climate chaos is looking at asset managers and various institutional investors. And there you could see the South African players, which are quite substantial. So Investec, for example, it might not make the top 60 banks that are funding fossil fuel projects, but it did make it was quite a significant player when you look at where they're investing their money and whether it's in dirty projects.
So the whole world is encouraged to be more environmentally responsible. We've seen today Australia's oldest coal-fired plant being shut down, but we don't always see the same kind of commitment. Are advocacy groups having any impact? Are the banks being exposed enough and feeling the pressure, or are we not quite there yet?
I think it definitely is. We've seen significant progress. The very fact that there's a net zero alliance within the banking sector is a huge thing. As I said, the policies do make a difference. They've got to do more than that. There's of the 60 banks that were profiled in the report, for example, 59 of them do not have policies that are robust enough to actually stop. Let me backtrack a bit. So if you have that 1.5 degree limit, and that was the Paris Agreement limit that in general countries all over the world agreed to, and it's the benchmark for the limit that we can go in terms of fossil fuels and global warming. If banks continue to finance fossil fuel projects the way they have been doing, there's no way that we will meet that 1.5 degree target. Okay. So they need to practice what they preach and not just have policies around it. But even those policies, they aren't robust enough to stop that, to limit that 1.5 degree increase. The fossil fuel projects, especially around exploration of gas and oil, if we continue doing that, so exploration means that they are new projects. We're looking at gas reserves that aren't yet being exploited. Those will push us beyond the 1.5 degrees. And that's, it's absolutely catastrophic for the globe.
Right, so absolutely more needs to be done, more pressure and more legislation to try and curb that investment and that funding. Thank you very much. That was Tabitha Paine, an attorney in the Corporate Accountability and Transparency Programme at the Centre for Environmental Rights.